On the 12th of August 1969, sectarian tensions that had been simmering throughout Northern Ireland since October the previous year finally boiled over. On the streets of Derry, nationalist residents were engaged in a series of desperate pitched battles with the largely Protestant Royal Ulster Constabulary following a controversial apprentice boys parade which took place in the city earlier that day. Fear gripped the island of Ireland, not least the fear that the violence in Derry would escalate and in a doomsday scenario turn into a full-scale episode of ethnic cleansing against the Catholic population of the north.
For the Irish government, this outbreak of violence in the north was the biggest crisis the country had faced since the beginning of World War II. As the rioting raged in Derry, the Taoiseach Jack Lynch called an emergency cabinet meeting in Dublin. It was a meeting that was to expose bitter divisions between political heavyweights within the government, and one in which high-profile hardliners in Northern Ireland were to demand that Jack Lynch mobilise the Irish army and invade the north.
The atmosphere is one of considerable tension, of anger, of uncertainty, of the need to respond.
Many people in the south probably would have approved of a government decision to send the Irish army across the border in the circumstances of the time.
Remarkably, within weeks of that cabinet meeting, the Irish army had drawn up contingency plans assessing a range of options for intervention in the north, including sending its own men across the border.
There were rumours of troop movements in the south, that Irishers were definitely, so-and-so has seen them, they're coming in the Letterkenny Road.
It was a very emotive time, and we shouldn't underestimate that. When we look back now 40 years later with a cooler, more detached eye, we could characterise some of the contributions as being slightly hysterical. But there was a feeling of slight hysteria at that time in August 1969.
It is clear also that the Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
This is the story of one of the most dramatic and dangerous periods in recent Irish history. It's also the story of what could have happened if Lynch had invaded. After a day of violence in Derry and high drama in the corridors of power in Dublin, London and Belfast, on August 13th, 1969, the Taoiseach Jack Lynch prepared to make a live televised statement at 9 o'clock that evening. As he made his way to the RTE studios in Dublin, Lynch knew that throughout the country people were waiting anxiously to hear how the government would react to the violence that had taken hold of the north. Violence that many feared might turn into a bloodbath, not least for Northern Catholics, and engulf the island of Ireland in civil war. Now, one of the most important and potentially one of the most explosive speeches in modern Irish history was contained in a heavily scribbled note in the Taoiseach's hands. As he arrived at the studios, Lynch was greeted by Des Fisher, the senior editor on duty in the newsroom, who was responsible for getting the Taoiseach's speech on air.
He came in and I met him at the front door. The funny thing about it all that I remember now is that he was on his own. He came with the driver, but then I took him up alone into the reception room. As he came in, he was very preoccupied because he was still half working on the script. And I saw that the script was badly worked over. So there was words crossed out and other words put on top of them, lines coming out and bubbles containing new sentences. I said to him, Mr. Lynch, I can't let you go on air with a script in that condition. Because you're bound to make mistakes, you're bound to leave something out, and it wouldn't be right, it wouldn't be fair. So I'd like to get the script taken away, and I'll get it retyped. When I was out, I got a bottle of paddy. I knew he liked paddy, and some water, and brought it to him.
The fact that Jack Lynch had arrived at RTE with his script in such a poor condition reflected how what he was about to say had been the subject of fierce debate at the Cabinet that afternoon.
There's an entire separate history around the speech that Lynch made on the evening of the 13th of August. The various drafts it goes through, what's presented to the Cabinet earlier in the day. And I think that the fumbling with the scrappy, poorly written speech is indicative of the situation in the Cabinet that day, the uncertainties and the poorly prepared policy, that they're doing everything on the hoof. It's ad hoc decisions taken without proper intelligence information, without proper briefings. They're reacting. Dublin's policy on the 13th is a reactive policy.
My recollection is of that day and that meeting was that there were a couple of drafts, I think. One perhaps more bellicose than the other. The less bellicose draft was adopted by Lynch and by the government, but it was a speech of great importance. It wasn't long or detailed, but it was strong, and it needed to be strong in the circumstances of what we were seeing was happening in the north, and in particular in Derry.
With millions of people in the country, north and south, hanging on his every word, at 9 p.m, Jack Lynch began his speech in measured tones.
Good evening. It is with deep sadness that you and I, Irishmen and women of goodwill, have learned of the tragic events which have been taking place in Derry and elsewhere in the north in recent days. This concern is heightened by the realization that the spirit of reform and intercommunal cooperation has given way to the forces of sectarianism and prejudice. Very many people have been injured, and some of them seriously. We have therefore directed the Irish Army authorities to have field hospitals established in County Donegal, adjacent to Derry, and at other points along the border where they may be necessary.
But within the speech, one sentence in particular was to cause hope, alarm and confusion throughout Ireland and Britain.
It is clear also that the Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse.
So what did Lynch mean by these words? In particular, what did he mean by the phrase, the Irish government can no longer stand by? To some people, this amounted to a declaration of war.
I think the key phrase in the speech is that Lynch says that his government will not stand by. Now, what does stand by mean? It then became, to many people, stand idly by. But that's not what he said. But it's a perception. It's an open-ended invitation to something. But that was unknown what that would be, and so people put their interpretations on it.
Having completed his historic broadcast, Lynch left the RTE studios shortly after 9 o'clock. But as he did so, the impact of his speech was already being felt, not just at army bases in the south, but also within the Northern Irish Cabinet at Stormont, just outside Belfast.
Oh, I think in the unionist community, growing alarm, I think some of them certainly persuaded themselves that, there was a real possibility of the Irish army moving over the border.
The mood is such that there's only one way of interpreting this, that the various battalions of the Defence Forces are going to be crossing the border after nightfall. This is the kind of classic way that a state might set up an invasion of neighbouring territory.
Fearing that an invasion by the Irish army was imminent, the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Chichester Clark, immediately dispatched Junior Home Affairs Minister John Taylor to the RUC headquarters in Belfast, where he was under strict instructions to stay alongside the Inspector General Anthony Peacock and to await further orders.
Chichester Clark believed that the Irish army was going to invade Northern Ireland. I was very anxious, very worried, because I knew it depended on me advising the Prime Minister exactly what was going on.
With John Taylor at RUC headquarters, Chichester Clark then turned to the Protestant-dominated B Specials. This was a heavily armed reserve police force which was both hated and feared by Northern nationalists. That night, Chichester Clark ordered the mobilisation of 8,000 B Specials throughout the province. As news of this mobilisation spread, tensions increased, with violence moving beyond Derry itself. Some began to blame this on Lynch's provocative speech, claiming that he was fanning the flames of sectarian hatred.
It was one of the most irresponsible contributions to the 30-odd years of problems that we had in Northern Ireland. To imply that you were going to invade Northern Ireland meant that the British majority community here were going overboard, and there was a great danger they were going to retaliate against the Catholic minority, and that there would be an outbreak of civil war.
Here in London, Lynch's words were also causing alarm. The Labour government's Home Secretary, James Callaghan, got back to his office at about 11 o'clock, 2 hours after Lynch had spoken. His officials here hadn't seen the speech, but they were already worried about what they were hearing. When they finally did get a transcript, their worst fears were confirmed. Now Callaghan not only had to worry about the potential for a civil war in the north, but also the possibility of an invasion from the south.
Well, it was thought to be very unhelpful speak. It was thought to add perhaps new elements of danger to what was a very dangerous situation. The idea that another government would come in and try to assume control compulsorily from an area over which the British government had sovereignty. I mean, that could be close to being an act of war, really, close to being an invasion, and that would not have been acceptable.
Well, insofar as I recall it, it would have been such marked contrast with all the other knowledge I had about the Dublin government. They didn't want to take over an angry north with a Protestant majority. And it always rather worried me, having been throughout my life sympathetic to the nationalist cause, to find how little interest Dublin took. But maybe the scale of the crisis at that time made it obvious to the Irish government they couldn't stand by. But I think even a suggestion that an intervention might have occurred would have put the whole thing into a different context.
But while Lynch's speech was provoking deep concern in London and Belfast, in Dublin it was considered appropriate and justified.
Well, the situation in the north and the brutality of the police was such that strong things needed to be said to try and alert world opinion, and particularly British opinion, to the potentially very serious consequences of what was happening. And I think that the speech achieved that. If it caused a certain amount of alarm in Britain and Stormont, well, it's no harm that it did, because Britain was prepared to condone what Stormont was doing, and Stormont seemed to feel that it was entitled to do whatever it liked.
Lynch's speech was also having a major impact here in the Bogside in Derry, where fighting between nationalists and the RUC was at its most intense. Many residents, having seen Lynch's speech on television, were convinced that the Irish Army was actually on its way to the Bogside to rescue them.
When word got out about Jack Lynch's speech, for a start, it was misrepresented almost immediately. You know, this was that we will not stand idly by. And people added things onto it, that we are going to move and so forth. There were rumours of troop movements in the south, that people unidentified had seen Irish Army units on the move towards the border. Remember this wild rumour that Irishers were definitely, so-and-so has seen them, they're coming in the Letterkenny Road.
Jack Lynch has done more hours to help the people of Derry than they expected him to do.
I agree.
And you cannot say nothing about Jack Lynch. I don't care whether he's Fianna Fáil or what he is. He's a gentleman, and he's going to send in help to Derry.
Of course, Lynch's speech, and in particular his words, "We will not stand by," may have encouraged the belief that an Irish invasion of the North was imminent. But any belief, any hopes, or even fears perhaps, that the Irish Army were about to move into Derry, or any other part of the North for that matter, were clearly misguided. But what if Lynch's speech had actually signalled such an invasion? In fact, just hours before his appearance on RTE television, Lynch had presided over a bitterly divided cabinet meeting, during which some of his senior cabinet ministers had actually advocated such an invasion of Northern Ireland.
For several months, Jack Lynch and his cabinet had been increasingly concerned that the volatile situation in the north was going to get out of control.
It seems to cause problems every year.
In particular, they were deeply worried that a controversial march by the Protestant apprentice boys in Derry on the 12th of August would spark widespread sectarian violence.
I wasn't involved in any negotiations around the apprentice boys. It wasn't my parliamentary area, so to speak. That it should have been the centre of considerable concern would have been perfectly reasonable. The apprentice boys had, to use their own expression in later years of other people, had trailed their coats through the city.
In the apprentice boys demonstration back in the 1960s, came right through the centre of the city and past the Bogside. We could see it. And that was always resented by people in the Bogside area who saw it. I saw the Apprentice Boys Parade as a sort of ritualised celebration of Catholic second-class citizenship.
Deeply worried about the potential for serious trouble in Derry and the management of it by Stormont, the Dublin government dispatched its Minister for External Affairs, Patrick Hillery, to London to express its concerns. But the British Foreign Secretary, Michael Stewart, insisted that what happened in Derry was strictly an internal British matter, and told Hillery that the situation would not get out of hand.
I think one of the difficulties for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin in the late 1960s was to strike a balance between being seen to be proactive in this regard and also being seen not to be too aggressive. So I think what Patrick Hillery was trying to do was to press home the gravity of the situation to an English audience that didn't always seem to be that interested or that engaged with what was going on. There's always a sense that London has its eyes on other things aside from the Northern Ireland problem, and there seemed to be a curious reluctance on London's part to accept what might happen.
Well, the government gave various warnings to the British before the 12th of August that they were apprehensive about potential serious trouble in Derry particularly, and I suppose in the north generally. But by and large those warnings were ignored.
With the violence that erupted here after the controversial Apprentice Boys March of August the 12th, the situation here in Derry had got out of hand. The RUC, under the control of the Northern Ireland government at Stormont, was stretched beyond capacity. And in the Bogside, they repeatedly baton charged the nationalist crowd. And for the first time in the United Kingdom, in these streets, tear gas was used against civilians. In return, the nationalist crowd showered the RUC again and again with bottles, stones and petrol bombs.
Everything was happening very quickly at that point. I have a very clear memory in the early part of that the conflict was between the people in the Bogside and the police.
We never experienced anything like this before. The stones were just coming down like hail. But then I noticed that there was petrol bombs being thrown. When the petrol bomb hit me, of course it enveloped me completely in flames. Naturally, the flames were all around me. I couldn't see my way out. It was widely published all around the world, that photograph. And then I was, my colleagues got me out and eventually got me to hospital.
The police were not containing the issue. They were fighting. They were hurling stones back. You know, they were engaged in battle. They were not engaged in containing a riotous situation. They were an integral part of creating it and continuing it.
It felt frightening, but it also was very exciting. It was a really exciting time, and people were really vivid. I can remember the feeling of it today far more clearly than I can remember some of the incidents on the ground, because it was a mixture of fear, of pride, that people were standing up for themselves, that we were standing up for ourselves, of high expectation that dramatic things might come of this and that we were in the middle sort of the events which were going to trigger a dramatic developments.
As day broke on the 13th of August, the political impact of the Battle of the Bogside was being felt in Dublin, Belfast and here in London. At Stormont, the Northern Irish Cabinet Ministers held an emergency session. They knew that by now, both themselves and the RUC were in danger of losing control of the situation, but they were still solidly opposed to handing over their law and order powers to Westminster by calling in the British Army. As the Stormont government was meeting in the south, ministers, many of whom were on holiday, were hastily making their way back to Dublin for an emergency cabinet meeting that had been scheduled for 2:15 that afternoon. Amongst those who returned to Dublin for the meeting was Jack Lynch's parliamentary secretary, Des O'Malley.
Like everyone else, I suppose I'd have listened to the radio and watched television and really gone to see what was happening, which unfortunately turned out to, really fulfill our worst fears in a sense, because it became very serious.
As he was driven up from his own holidays in West Cork, Jack Lynch became increasingly concerned by press reports on the dire situation in Derry and by the news that the trouble was spreading to Belfast, Dungannon and Newry. When the cabinet did meet, there were problems from the outset. Attempts to contact the various ministers whilst on their holidays had not been entirely successful, and 4 of them, including the Minister for External Affairs, Patrick Hillery, and the Minister for Justice, Michael Moran, were not present. Of the 10 ministers who were present at the meeting, several, notably Neil Blaney and Kevin Boland, favoured strong and decisive action over the North. Now Lynch, who sought consensus over his preferred wait-and-see approach to the problem, was struggling to impose his authority in the cabinet.
I think the challenge was to dissuade the hotheads, the Republicans in his cabinet, from insisting that we go to the aid of the NATO, supply them with guns, so on. All that was in the air.
Here we are drinking tea and coffee. We'd want to send the army in immediately. I mean, how long are we going to sit here? Huh?
I think it was a terrifying period for him, because he knew he couldn't rely on support from major colleagues. He knew, of course, that there were some, but it was hard to discern at that time, I think, who was for peace and who was for invasion. There were people that you wouldn't expect who were so Republican that they thought they had to resort to arms.
So let's act now.
Boland was the most vocal, and Blaney was not far behind him, I think.
Derry, in my view, it's as much as part of Ireland as Dublin and Cork.
And their attitude was that the Irish government should take a very belligerent stance. They wanted, overt military activity. I suppose a nice way to put it would be hearts ruling heads, but I think that there were some people who, kind of felt that violence was justifiable.
I think he had this difficulty, that the strongest personalities in the cabinet were on the side of intervention.
Blaney and Boland in particular saw themselves as the inheritors of the Fianna Fáil Republican tradition, and when the events of 1969 began to unfold, they believed that they knew what was right for Fianna Fáil and what was right for the country, and they believed that intervention in the North was what should be done. They saw it as the opportunity to end partition.
At 3:15, an hour into its emergency meeting, Lynch's cabinet agreed to send an urgent message to the British government, requesting the immediate cessation of police attacks on the people of Derry. The message was to be delivered by Kevin Rush, Chargé d'Affaires at the Irish Embassy in London, who arranged to meet the British Minister of State, Lord Chalfont, at the Foreign Office at 5 p.m. But while he was waiting to meet Chalfont, Rush received a second message from Dublin. This instructed him to request that the British government apply immediately to the United Nations for the urgent dispatch of a peacekeeping force to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Rush was also told to inform the British that the United Nations was being made aware of this communication. This attempt to internationalise the situation by getting the UN involved was a dramatic raising of the stakes by the Irish government. But in their meeting, Lord Chalfont told Rush that he couldn't accept that the RUC were targeting civilians, and he also reasserted Westminster's position that what happened in Northern Ireland was an internal British matter and that it had nothing to do with the UN.
The cabinet, I think, like a lot of people in Ireland, were very frustrated at the attitude that the British took. Legalistically, they may have been right in saying it was an internal United Kingdom matter, legalistically, but politically and from a common sense point of view, it certainly was a broader matter than just an internal British or UK matter.
While it was getting little satisfaction in London, back in Dublin, the emergency cabinet meeting continued. And late in the afternoon, Jack Lynch and his ministers were about to take a third and highly dramatic decision. One that was to ratchet the tension up to unprecedented levels.
Those cabinet ministers who were pushing were not going to have to go and do and possibly die. They were safe in Leinster House. You can put the gun in somebody else's hand, but you don't have to take the dire consequences of possibly being killed.
If we had been told, or if we had known, because some ministers may have known, if we had been told that there might have been a military intervention from the public, it would be seen an absolutely major crisis.
As sectarian violence in Northern Ireland threatened to spill out of control, and with very real fears of a pogrom against the Catholic population in the north. In Dublin, the Taoiseach Jack Lynch called an emergency cabinet meeting on August 13th, 1969.
I think we've waited long enough. If we don't...
Lynch's cabinet was bitterly divided, with nationalist hardliners like Neil Blaney and Kevin Boland demanding a forceful reaction to the violence in the north. By late afternoon, the cabinet had already made two demands of the British government: that it stop the attacks by the RUC on nationalists in Derry, and that it call in a United Nations peacekeeping force. But having been rebuffed by the British towards the end of their extraordinary meeting, Lynch and his ministers made two bold decisions: to set up army field hospitals in Donegal and at other points along the border, and to move 250 soldiers up to the same areas, close to the north.
This decision to involve the Irish Army was a deliberately forceful and potentially dangerous development, with several battalions of the British Army already mobilised in Northern Ireland, in Derry, Omagh and Belfast. The actions of the Irish government represented, in clear and simple terms, a direct military escalation of the confrontation.
The establishment of field hospitals, while it was sort of quasi-military in its nature, if you like, was essentially humanitarian. A lot of people were being injured, and for one reason or another, a lot of them didn't feel safe going into hospitals in the north. Well, then they had to be facilitated.
The implications of sending quantities of troops from barracks to field positions, even if they're troops who are manning field hospitals and logistics units and that, is one that will have considerable repercussions nationally and internationally. Movements of this type hadn't happened for at least a generation, and it doesn't matter that they were simply field hospitals, it's the fact that the defence forces are on the move that causes emotions and causes imaginations to run wild. Particularly for those embattled in the bogside, thinking, here are the forces that are come to liberate us. The army is with us. The Irish army will move across the border from these advanced positions and we'll be free.
Gormanstown was a hive of activity. I was training to be a 3-star soldier at that stage, which was the final part of your training. We would ordinarily have our free time in the evening after formal training had ceased. This evening, we were all lined up again. We were issued with a bandolier of 50 rounds of 303 ammunition, and we had our 303s, the Lee Enfields. It was totally out of context. Ordinarily, ammunition would never be issued in this casual setting. We had our web kit and our rifle, and we were all kind of looking around to see what was going on, what was this all about.
Morale was good, morale was high, because we realised, you know, you get the feeling and sort of the grapevine starts to work, and sort of the rumour machine goes into operation, and we were up, whatever was going to happen, to use the sort of modern parlance, we were up for it.
We were then isolated and moved into a billet, which was not our normal accommodation. It was a billet down pretty close to the gate. A truck with its tailgate down was reversed right in against the front of the building at the door, which meant that you could only either get into that truck or out the other door. It seemed we were being readied for a mission, some mission which we all figured at this stage was related to the turmoil that was going on the TV.
Well, we knew that there was a strong possibility that we would go as far as the border, maybe across it. I suppose the best way to describe it is a sort of an atmosphere of eager anticipation. You know, it's sort of, we would have been quite happy if somebody came and opened the billet door and said, right chaps, we're off. That was it. We were young, we were keen, we were volunteer soldiers. And whatever our superiors told us to do, we would have done it.
While the army was preparing for possible action, back in the cabinet room, tension over how the government was going to respond to the crisis continued to escalate.
It's time to make history. That's what leaders do.
So what was Jack Lynch to do? Armed with only sketchy and unreliable information from the north, he feared that a pogrom could break out at any moment, one that could claim the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of nationalists. At the same time, he was coming under intense pressure from some of the most forceful members of his cabinet. Men who were demanding desperate measures for desperate times. Men who, in effect, were demanding that Ireland go to war with Britain.
Today, the idea of such an act of declaring war on Britain might seem absurd, unthinkable even. But in fact, by 1970, the Irish military authorities had generated a war game which envisaged exactly that scenario. The war game was called Exercise Armageddon, and this top secret military document sets out in detail its aims and objectives. It refers to Northern Ireland as Red Land and the British or Red forces as the enemy. Blue Land is the Republic. The document also describes Exercise Armageddon as a continuing war game which will be played over and over again, and sets it out as a paper exercise for officers rather than an operation to be carried out in the field. But the Defence Forces were not just drawing up war games, and in fact within weeks of the August 13th cabinet meeting, the military authorities were authors of an even more remarkable document. This document, dated the 27th of September 1969 and prepared by senior military personnel, contains a wide range of options for military operations north of the border. The remarkable activities it assesses include arming and training nationalist groups in the north and staging so-called unconventional operations, sabotage and perhaps bombings at key installations in Belfast such as the airport and television studios. Incredibly though, while acknowledging the weaknesses of the Irish Army and the serious risk that the British would respond with a military assault on the Republic, the document goes on to suggest that 2 attacks could be mounted across the border, one at Derry and one at Newry.
Well, I think that would have constituted an invasion. I believe that the British government would have reacted by saying, you either get out or we'll come and fight you. And I think that would have ended up in a terrible situation.
It is an absurdity to think that, quite frankly, a puny military force like the Irish Army could in any form whatsoever take on the British Army.
Mad. I don't need to say any more. Mad. Quite mad.
The British Army was experienced. It was used to mounting military operations worldwide. It was a strategic army. It could have had reinforcements over in Ulster in hours. The Irish had none of those assets. The Irish Army was tin pot.
We were short in a lot of areas, there's no doubt about that. We were short in heavy weapons, we were short in armour, we were short in armoured personnel carriers. We had little or no air cover, or wouldn't have had, so all in all, a small, well-trained army, but not a lot of us.
Also, a lot of the equipment was quite obsolescent, if not obsolete. Our transport was old.
It's embarrassing to say that we were so short of the basics.
The Irish Defence Forces in the 1960s are effectively a World War II standard army equipped with arguably World War I equipment. So when push came to shove in August 1969, the forces found themselves absolutely unprepared because for the preceding decades, their political masters had seen no reason to actually build up the defence forces.
But despite the fact that for years their predecessors had overseen the running down of the defence forces, senior government ministers continued to demand a military solution to the crisis that was gripping the country. And as they did so, Lynch found himself in an increasingly difficult situation.
We're the ones who have the authority. We're the ones who have the power. So let's act now.
So what would have happened if Lynch had succumbed to the hardliners within his cabinet?
What if the will of men like Neil Blaney and Kevin Boland had prevailed at that momentous cabinet meeting on August 13th?
And what if the decision had been taken to send the Irish Army across the border into Northern Ireland?
Of course, we'll never know the answer to any of these questions for certain, but this is our opinion of what could have happened, both on the battlefield and in the corridors of power, if Lynch had invaded. With the decision taken to send troops into the north, a remarkable sequence of events is underway. Immediately, Lynch summons his Chief of Staff, General Sean McKeown, to his office, and he tells him that he needs the army to take action, to do something, as a serious political gesture north of the border.
So what would McKeown have done in such a doomsday scenario? Based on the actual military documents that were generated within weeks of Lynch's cabinet meeting, I believe that McKeown could have proposed 2 offensive operations, one against Derry and one against Newry. But if push came to shove, he would have confined it to one company in attack on the town of Newry. He would have done so because Newry was the most accessible border town for Irish troops and because it contained an overwhelming nationalist majority.
The decision to initiate this dramatic and dangerous military action in the north is one that Jack Lynch would have taken extremely reluctantly and under significant duress. He would have known that as Taoiseach he was now leading the country towards the biggest challenge it had ever faced. As the Chief of Staff returned from the Taoiseach's office to Defence Headquarters, Lynch would already be on his way to the RT studios in Donnybrook for his 9 o'clock speech to the nation. This would be an incredible moment in Irish history. Although the people watching it wouldn't realise it, Lynch's speech, and in particular that phrase, "we will not stand by," would be an ominous and thinly veiled reference to plans that were already starting to take shape. Plans to invade Northern Ireland.
Good evening.
It is with deep sadness that you and I, Irishmen and women of goodwill, have learned of the tragic events which have been taking place in Derry and elsewhere in the north in recent days. All people of goodwill must feel saddened and disappointed at this backward turn in events and must be apprehensive for the future. The government fully share these feelings.
Within 24 hours of receiving the Taoiseach's instructions to prepare for an incursion into the north, the Chief of Staff, Sean McKeown, summons his senior officers to a top-secret meeting at Defence Headquarters in Dublin.
But it is clear now that the present situation cannot be allowed to continue. It is clear also that the Irish government can no longer stand by, can no longer stand by, can no longer stand by.
Within 72 hours of this meeting, a company of 120 men is formed in Dublin to prepare for the attack on Newry. At the same time, the army would have begun working on the transport required for the operation. This would have been a difficult task. However, there were just enough trucks, Land Rovers and cavalry vehicles necessary to get the troops and the support elements north to carry out the mission. However, the situation was so fraught that there is even some talk in the military document of a requirement perhaps to hire buses to move the troops north to the border.
The first thing that would strike you about an army on the move is how it defends itself. And unless you have control of the skies over your head, you're in for a hiding, I can tell you.
While the army is preparing for action, the tension within the cabinet is extraordinary. These 14 ministers would know that soon they will be the men responsible for one of the most heroic or one of the most bloody and foolhardy episodes in Irish history. Without doubt, Lynch will be hoping that the act of sending troops into the north will create an international situation, one that will result in a UN peacekeeping force being brought in to provide stability in the north. And above all, he'll be hoping that the arrival of such a force will prevent an all-out and deadly confrontation between the Irish and British armies. But there were problems with such a strategy. Being the aggressor, the Irish government were not in a strong position to call for peacekeeping forces. And had they done so, the British government would simply have restated their position that what happened in Northern Ireland was an internal British matter, which had nothing to do with either the Irish government or the UN. Quite simply, there would be no UN blue helmets to come between the British and the Irish armies.
What you have to understand is, if we look at it from Dublin's perspective and what they're trying to do, it's completely out of kilter with all accepted modes of international behaviour. The United Nations was set up after the Second World War with one of its primary aims, territorial integrity. The whole tenure of international law was about preserving the sovereignty of nation states. And the Irish government, regardless of what it said in Articles 2 and 3, the international accepted view was that Northern Ireland was part of the British state. As simple as that. And they would be infringing it. They would have no case to put before the United Nations. They would also be taking on a NATO power. They would get no support in Europe from Britain's NATO allies. The result of this would have just been a calamity for Dublin and the Irish state internationally as well as internally.
But despite the overwhelming odds, the invasion is about to begin. Motivated by the belief that they are going to help their fellow citizens in the north, the troops are prepared for action. And at midnight, advance parties cross the border to reconnoitre main junctions and routes into Newry and to begin cutting communications north. They also seize the northern border checkpoint, swiftly and possibly without bloodshed.
Get the weapon, get the weapon, get the weapon!
Shortly afterwards, at 0100 hours, the main body of 120 troops is split into 3 platoons and moves into Northern Ireland. Time would have been of the essence. Number 1 platoon would have staged a lightning assault on the RUC station at the northern edge of the town. With the cover of darkness and a strong element of surprise, I think they would have been successful in this.
Hands up! Don't move it! Okay, down, right, down! Keep your hands up, lads. Not moving.
Back in Dublin, Jack Lynch and his cabinet would be in constant session, receiving regular updates from Sean McKeown, the Army Chief of Staff. Likewise, in London, John G. Malloy and his staff at the Irish Embassy there would be in constant contact with the Taoiseach's office, bracing themselves for the storm that was about to come their way.
While the assault on the RUC station was underway, Number 2 platoon would have acted quickly to seize the main junctions here at the centre of Newry to secure an evacuation corridor south for refugees fleeing the conflict zone. In addition, they would have requisitioned buses, trucks, anything to get refugees moving.
Newry itself wouldn't have presented the problem. It would be a case of protecting Newry. And we had a fairly cynical quartermaster, actually, who, I remember when he was giving us the ammunition, he said 50 rounds. When you get to Newry, you better try and take the RUC barracks, but you're going to need whatever ammunition they have in there as well, because 50 rounds is not going to last you too long. Newry didn't present a problem. It was a case of go over there and protect the town.
At 0500 hours, there would have been no British Army units in the town. And apart from some nationalists who might have come out to support the Irish troops, there would have been an eerie calm in the town. For the Irish, this would have been the calm before a likely and possibly terrible storm. Before long, the first response to the Irish incursion arrives, in the form of local units of the B Specials. Many of these men are well-trained ex-British Army soldiers with operational experience abroad. But while they are able to inflict some casualties in the Irish troops, they do not pose a serious threat to the overall operation.
By now, the Chief of Staff, Sean McKeown, is reporting to Jack Lynch and his cabinet and informing them that the army has achieved its 2 main objectives in crossing the border. It has established a token presence within the north and has created a corridor south for nationalist refugees. McKeown also tells them that all of this has been achieved without any serious casualties on either side. This would be hugely encouraging for Lynch, and no doubt the news that the Irish flag was now flying in the north would unleash a welling of patriotic pride among some of his ministers. Some might even have thought or dared to hope that this was the start of the end for partition. But a key question remained: how was Britain going to react to the presence of a foreign army on its soil?
The sequence of events is you establish, is what you've been told true? Are they? Have they come, or is it just a rumour? And you do that with reconnaissance by ministers ringing up Dublin and saying, is it true that you put troops across? And so you would establish the fact. The government here would then meet in cabinet and decide on a reaction. They could either, which could range from we'll do nothing about it, through various levels of response, to saying get out or we'll throw you out.
I can't believe that if the Irish government had come forward with a military plan, they wouldn't have also come forward with a political solution. And what would their political solution have been? You don't go to war if you haven't got war aims. What would the Irish government war aims have been? Was it been to get rid of Stormont? Was it have been to save the nationalist community? Was it to end partition? What was it about?
This morning, the Government Information Bureau has released the following statement. In response to the escalating violence and ongoing attacks of the nationalist community in the north, at 1 o'clock this morning, members of the Irish Defence Forces crossed the border into County Down.
In the Republic, people would be waking up to the astonishing news that overnight their army had invaded part of the United Kingdom. Speculation would have been rife about the Republic reclaiming the north, about this being the start of the end for partition. There would have been criticism. People had no illusions about the strength of the British Army. But for some, the move would have provoked a wave of emotional, patriotic support for Lynch and his government. They'd have been seen as men of action, bravely standing up to the British.
I think emotions ran so high over the summer of 1969 that there would have been a significant degree of popular support for the sending of troops over the border. Because I think people would have reverted to the notion that they are our people. People in the Republic can identify with those who are being subjected to what they would have seen as this state-approved violence, to this state-sponsored aggression. So I think there would have been those who would have thought that a further step that would have involved the movement of troops over the border, that wouldn't necessarily have been the wrong thing to do.
Despite any public support there may have been for the invasion, the mood back in the cabinet room is already beginning to change. The Chief of Staff, Sean McKeown, reports a dramatic increase in RAF air activity over Newry. And he informs Lynch and his ministers that his troops are consolidating their positions and preparing for a counterattack by British soldiers and a possible airstrike.
RAF and reconnaissance planes and fighter jets.
Now, after the first flush of excitement and trepidation over their unilateral act of hostility, this has an extremely sobering effect on the cabinet members. For some of them, perhaps it is only now that the enormity of what they have undertaken is becoming clear. And as news of the military incursion starts to spread to Washington and across Europe, Lynch and his colleagues discover that they are men with very few friends.
With the Irish troops having dug in just south of Newry, since early morning they have become familiar with the ominous sight and sound of British Army helicopters flying overhead, checking out their strength and locations. Shortly afterwards, the men find themselves outnumbered as the first British troops appear in the scene just to the north of their positions. The British Army enjoyed more than just numerical superiority at this point. The British were a well-trained, well-equipped professional fighting force, well used to large-scale combat operations precisely such as this. What was shaping up now for the Irish was a tragic mismatch. And as tension continues to mount within the Irish ranks, soon the sound of helicopters is replaced by the terrifying roar of low-flying RAF fighter jets. Fortunately for the Irish on this occasion, the RAF would not have delivered their payload of high explosives onto their positions. Rather, their intention would have been to deliver a chilling and demoralising warning to the troops. And with that as their target, they would have struck bullseye.
While the Irish soldiers are becoming increasingly concerned about their precarious position, in London, the Irish ambassador, John G. Malloy, would have been called back to the Foreigner Commonwealth Office. There, instead of being asked about what his government were up to, he would have been given a very stark and simple message to relay to Dublin. If the Irish government didn't withdraw its troops from Northern Ireland before 1 p.m, the British would have no option but to force them to do so. Within minutes of leaving the Foreign Office, Malloy would have been back at his desk at the Irish Embassy in Grosvenor Place, relaying the British ultimatum back to Dublin. So what were Jack Lynch and his government to do now? Having gone so far, having sent their troops north of the border and having seized Northern Irish territory, would they just capitulate and tell the troops to come home? Or would they be prepared to call the bluff of the British government and defy the ultimatum?
That's all we've done.
If you're asking me the question of what would have happened if they'd taken on British troops, the answer is an awful lot of them would have got killed.
I think the fighting would have been very fierce, actually, because I think the soldiers on both sides were high-quality people.
Serving soldiers are very simple beings. We do what we're told.
At 9 p.m. on the 13th of August 1969, the Taoiseach Jack Lynch made a dramatic televised speech to the nation, declaring that his government would not stand by while nationalists in the north came under attack from the police and loyalist gangs. For many people, there was only one way to interpret these words. The Irish Army was about to invade Northern Ireland. Just 6 weeks later, in September 1969, the Irish Army produced a remarkable and top-secret document that explored the possibilities for military action in the north. Had Lynch and his government felt compelled to act in August of 1969, I feel he would have opted for one of the scenarios outlined in this document. That is, the seizure of a town in Northern Ireland, close to the border, and with a strong nationalist population. Had such remarkable action been taken, 12 hours after crossing the border, the 120 Irish soldiers taking part in this dangerous operation would be holding their positions just south of Newry. But they would be facing not just a much superior British Army force, but also the threat of strikes from RAF fighter jets.
While this standoff is taking place in Newry, by now Jack Lynch and his cabinet colleagues have been issued with a stark ultimatum by the British government to withdraw their troops across the border or have them removed by force.
In the face of such an ultimatum, the doves within cabinet would no doubt have argued that it was time to withdraw, that as a government they had succeeded in drawing international attention to the situation in the north and had been seen to take firm and bold action in defence of northern nationalists. But for the Hawks, men like Neil Blaney and Kevin Boland, men who had argued at an emergency cabinet meeting on August 13th that troops should be sent north, such a withdrawal would have been seen as a capitulation to the British.
We're not going to put our tail between our legs and screw it down back across the border.
They would have argued that this was an historic moment, one that could bring about the end to partition, and that the government should stand firm and call the bluff of the British.
We have to stand up and make a stand. We have to make a stand. We might as well do it now as 5 years' time or 10 years' time. It will have to be done some stage.
Well, I can't imagine that that would have been allowed to happen. I can't imagine that the Irish government would have been so foolish as to allow that to happen. I mean, in other words, if their bluff was called, I imagine they would have withdrawn their troops, having made their point. And of course, that would have been headlines around the world, so that they would have made their point. But I mean, if you are saying that a very small army like the Irish Army, I mean, if you're asking me the question of what would have happened if they'd taken on British troops, the answer is an awful lot of them would have got killed, unless they had withdrawn. They'd have probably all been killed, or captured, or wounded. They would have not been in any possible way a match for the British Army. They would have been slaughtered.
Of course, we can never know who would have won the argument in the cabinet room, but if the Hawks had prevailed and if the British deadline for withdrawal had passed, it would have been a catastrophic error of judgment, one for which the Irish troops on the ground would have paid dearly.
My own opinion would have been, and is now, that it would have been a bloodbath.
Within minutes of the British government issuing orders to its army to remove the Irish from the north, the RAF Phantoms and Harriers would have been back in the sky over the Irish positions, and this time they would have meant business. Their first move would have been to knock out the Irish anti-aircraft and artillery positions, and this would have left them free to destroy in detail the Irish positions on the ground. The casualties would be mounting quickly, and they would be horrendous.
I think we would have been destroyed. The air situation would have been appalling, I imagine. I mean, if we invaded a sovereign country, you can imagine the repercussions, and we would have been hit very hard, and it would have been a disaster for us.
Within half an hour, the Army Chief of Staff, Sean McKeown, reports the catastrophic news to the Cabinet that south of Newry, his men are getting slaughtered. He points out that there is no option but to surrender immediately, that even a withdrawal is out of the question, as his men would be picked off as soon as they attempted to move south from their positions. If it hadn't already done so, the full enormity of what they had done would now be dawning on the Cabinet members. They may have thought that they were staging a humanitarian rescue mission for Northern nationalists. They may even have persuaded themselves that they were going to face down the British and perhaps even reunite the island. But instead, they had become responsible for a military fiasco, Ireland's own Bay of Pigs, in which its own young soldiers were being taken apart by British forces. There would be frantic efforts now to inform the British as quickly as possible that they were going to withdraw their troops, or what was left of them, back across the border.
Well, my own opinion is that it would have been a terrible mistake. We would have been ill-prepared, ill-equipped.
My own view was that our defence forces were not really in a position to make any large-scale incursions into anywhere, basically, across the border.
By now, the Cabinet's decision to withdraw will have come too late for many, if not most, of the Irish soldiers. Faced with a vastly superior force, the Irish could not have held out for more than an hour or so, and the final few minutes of combat would have been savage. By 1:30 or 2 p.m. that afternoon at the very latest, it would have all been over.
Kritisieren den irischen Prime Minister Jack Lynch für einen Kriegsakt gegen das Vereinigte Königreich.
The political fallout following the Irish Army's surrender would have been unprecedented. News of the war in Ireland would have been the big story spreading across the globe. In Europe, at the UN, and in Washington, despite protests from the Irish-American lobby, Jack Lynch and his government would have been condemned for an act of unprovoked aggression against what was supposed to have been a friendly neighbour. and they would have been castigated for an act of folly which had been a disaster for Ireland on every level, and one which had cost them the lives of scores of its own young men.
An obvious impact of any Irish military incursion in Northern Ireland would be a very bleak period politically, economically for Ireland, possibly a period of international isolation such as the country suffered at the end of the Second World War. You've also got to think of the impact it would have had on Irish America, how the Nixon administration would have viewed an invasion. It might not be too far-fetched to say that had there been even a limited invasion of Northern Ireland as a result of the decisions of 13th of August 1969, you would have Ireland today still a backward peripheral state on the Atlantic seaboard of Europe with limited international relations, with limited inward investment.
Good evening. It is with deep sadness that you and I, Irishmen...
Just 2 weeks after his "We Will Not Stand By" address to the nation, it's hard to imagine that Jack Lynch wouldn't soon be working on another speech, one in which he was to announce his resignation, because this escapade would almost definitely have seen the end of his political career.
This concern is heightened by the realization.
If some blood were spilt on the floor of the Cabinet Room in Dublin, rivers of blood might well have flowed throughout Northern Ireland, from the border north here to Belfast and other towns and villages. In a province fatally destabilised by invasion, the situation would have been far worse than it was at the height of the Battle of the Bogside. Loyalists, determined to get revenge for the Irish Army's invasion of Northern Ireland, may very well have engaged in escalating acts of sectarian violence. Indeed, if Lynch had invaded Northern Ireland, he might well have plunged the province into a cycle of ethnic cleansing similar to that seen in Yugoslavia during the 1990s.
The impact of an Irish Army intervention in the north is one thing, the loss of life that would have been involved, and the impact on the south, I think, would have been huge as well. I think you've got to look at places like Bosnia afterwards to imagine how things would have developed, because I think what Bosnia and Croatia showed us is that people who had lived together in relative harmony and peace very quickly descended into violence, unimaginable violence.
It could have led to a most awful uprising and pogrom almost, you know. I mean, this is a doomsday scenario. We've several times stood on the brink, but we've never actually fallen over it. Thank goodness we avoided that, and thank goodness at the end of the day, the people in positions of influence in London and in Dublin and Belfast paused on the brink of doing truly daft, irremediable things.
Had it taken place, the invasion of the North may have lasted just a few hours, but its effects would have been felt for decades north and south of the border, and would still be felt today.
It's an act that would have done enormous damage to Ireland's reputation on the international stage, and undoubtedly also an act that would have sabotaged the country's attempts to join the European Economic Community back in '73. And how different a place would Ireland be today if it hadn't joined the EEC?
I think conflict between British Army and Irish Army troops in Northern Ireland in 1969 would have set back Anglo-Irish relations by decades. There would perhaps have been a growing sense that these two countries cannot work together in cooperation with regard to future projects. Most obviously, of course, the European Economic Community. How would an Ireland and Britain at war with each other once again have played out in that European scenario? Would there have been a place for them in that European scenario? It's hard to see how they would have been welcomed with open arms.
Of course, we can never know for certain what the full impact of an invasion of Northern Ireland would have been, how such a remarkable act might have shaped our lives both north and south of the border. But we can be sure of one thing, that Ireland is a very different place today because Jack Lynch didn't invade.
I think we should regard ourselves as blessed, extremely fortunate, that the man in charge of affairs at the time was one who was not a product of violence. He had no family background of that kind, and his whole instincts were those of a civilized person trying to achieve what was necessary by reason rather than by force.
His actions had the net result, anyway, of keeping the Republic out of the conflict and reducing very substantially what would otherwise have been the loss of life, even though the loss of life was catastrophic over a 30-year period, 3,500 people. It could have been very much worse.
People would have died, and that's the end result. Probably a lot of people would have died, and the repercussions would have been huge, and we would have opened up sores and more civil unrest and all of that thing. It would have been awful. I'm glad it didn't happen. Mind you, as a professional soldier, if I'd been told to go, I'd have kissed my wife and kids goodbye and said, I'm going, I'm heading off. That's it. But I say, luckily it didn't happen.
Charged with the illegal importing of arms into the Republic of Ireland.
I have no intention of discussing the arms trial at this stage. The matters that are before the court are before the court, therefore sub judice.
Charles Haughey's exact role in that crisis will perhaps never be known.
The charge in the courts was one of conspiracy. On the other hand, nobody can doubt that there was an attempt to import arms illegally.
They have vindicated all those who have been smeared and blackguarded by the powers that be, who ran this trial not merely as a prosecution, but as the consul said inside, as a persecution. And I think they've got their answer today, and I hope they realise it and take the appropriate action after it.